Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Teens for Business podcast. I'm your host, Ivan.
I'm Kylin.
I'm Jack.
And I'm Jackie.
Today we'll be discussing the still ongoing UAW strike against the big three car manufacturers. The United Auto Workers, or called the UAW, has begun the strike on September 15 of 2023 and is considered the biggest auto strike in the recent history. And this strike involves around 150,000 auto workers from the big three manufacturers, so Ford, Stellantis, and General Motors. General Motors, and so these three factories employ about 145,000 UAW members, and they produce around 50% of the vehicles manufactured annually in the United States. So the United Auto Workers are pushing for a few things. For example, they are pushing for a 40% wage increase over 4 years in a new contract and an end to the two-tier wage systems, which we are going to talk more about later, and an increase in benefits for retirees and a return for a defined pension instead of a 401k. And they're also looking to reinstate the cost of living adjustment raises, a 32-hour working week, job security protections, and protections for workers affected by plant closures. So one of the biggest points United Auto Workers are saying that is a problem is that there's a vast disparity in pay between the workers and the higher ups. And so, for example, you have General Motors CEO Mary Barra, and she made $29 million in 2022. And that is 362 times the median wage of the normal worker, which is $80,000 at the same company. So why is this strike? Why is this strike such a big deal? And that is because there's a newly elected United Auto Workers president named Sean Fain, and he has been driving the charge, and he's basically been doing a lot of novel things never seen before during the strike. So it's been a lot of things have been changing, and the companies don't know how to deal with this new president. So what do you think are the main reasons for the United Auto Workers strike?
Yeah, I think that like Ivan mentioned, there's a large disparity in the income that a regular worker, like a median worker, makes compared to like the higher ups in the company. And with that being said, these workers know that they're worth more. So by striking, they believe that they can raise that how much money they're making because the higher ups are making so much money. If they just like take a little bit less money and then spread it out among the workers, and even that small amount can go a long way in terms of everyone that's just part of the workforce. And in addition to that, I also think that it's not just because like like the people at the very top of the company are making that much money. It's also because like they have a need, and that because of the cost of living is probably going up so much recently. And it's just that they know that if they can be making more money to help them out right now, that they need to that's going on strike is what they need to do. So I just personally think that paired together, like the fact that there's such a big wage disparity and the fact that there's so much prices are rising so heavily, that's why they felt the need to go on strike.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like the two-tier like system where there's like I guess like newer workers against like older workers. Like some employees think that although they're the newer workers, they're working at the same amount of hours for a similar job as like the older workers, yet they're going on much less pay, and they don't think that's fair. So that's definitely a root cause of these strikes. Another thing, in addition to Kyvan's like mention of like the rising cost of living, like adjusted for inflation, auto workers' wages have actually fallen by 19.3% since 2008. That's definitely not really like sustainable for like the job of like the auto workers. Like they're losing some money relative to what they could like spend, and especially during like higher living costs, especially in the past few years with COVID and the recession that followed right after COVID. and also rising gas prices, obviously, like it'll be more difficult to like sustain like the life of living while working with an auto working job.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. And I think like as we mentioned, it's kind of just like a really big combination of all the different factors because I was reading up on this and like apparently the pandemic and just like the general effects of what happened to the pandemics and the economy was a really big factor. And I think like just that big gap of like $80,000 like for your like mean salary versus like this almost $30 million for one person, like that's just a very big like gap in between. And of course like that's like mean versus like technically who's like at the top of the pyramid, but like that's still a really big gap, especially considering how like if you adjust for inflation, that like salary for the CEO has been like increasing, obviously. But then if you adjust for like the average worker, like Jack said, it's actually decreasing because of inflation. And I think like that is one of the biggest things. Like the industry has been doing well, but the workers' compensation hasn't been like accordingly adjusted. And I think like that is a big factor. Like if the industry was also failing, then it's like how like like it's a little more reasonable to have your wages also adjust to that failure in a sense. But if your industry is like doing relatively well, then like I think it like the from the workers' perspective and like from this union's perspective, it like they're just arguing for like their pay to be adjusted accordingly.
Yeah, definitely. The wages for these auto manufacturers for their workers are definitely haven't adjusted much since the pandemic and the new financial situations. And basically in general, the workers are unhappy. And this leads me to the next question is that are the demands for the United Auto Workers reasonable for these car manufacturer companies to implement in the near future?
Yeah, I do think they're reasonable. I think so. The demands are essentially that they want a 46% pay increase and a 4-day work week with overtime pay beyond 32 hours. And like Jack mentioned, the end of the 2 employment tiers, which is like one of the tiers is like older workers who are hired before 2007 that received more benefits, and then a younger tier of workers that were hired later. And I mean, these demands essentially with the industry doing like somewhat well right now, I feel like they are reasonable, but I feel like there is gonna be like a back and forth about like how much they're actually going to get. But is it like the workers currently the strike, like they're not getting paid like to do the job because they're on strike, but they are getting like I think $500 a week from the union just because they are part of the union. They're going on strike. They get $500 a week, which is still a lot less than they would normally. So I mean, depends on how long they hold out, but I think they're gonna come to like a median amount that they're satisfied with. But I do think these demands are mostly reasonable. I don't know how much essentially they're making that right now, but 46% pay increase, that's like kind of a lot. But I think that in terms of like how much they're working, I feel like overall I do think this is a somewhat reasonable demand.
Yeah, I agree. I do agree that it is also pretty somewhat reasonable. Like currently, I think what Ivan mentioned in the intro that the median wage is like 80,000 of like what a company in like General Motors. That's just like an example. And like as Kevin mentioned, 46% payday increase is quite a bit. But given like the living conditions right now, especially with the rising cost of living, we could definitely see that being very reasonable. And also the employment tiers as the years keep on rising, I guess like the amount of workers that are in that upper tier are gonna decrease a lot. And we can definitely see like those like workers that join later in the company. And when they join later in the companies, they'll probably demand like a higher wage. So they definitely could be reasonable for there as well.
Yeah, definitely agree. And one thing I would like to really quickly point out is that like for the 46%, like that number, it's not just like, oh yeah, like 2023, I'm making this much, and then the next year I'm suddenly going to be making like 46 increase of that. I think it's like their deal structure is like it's over a period of time, so it's not just immediate 46%. So I think like that is another thing to keep in mind when thinking of like if it's reasonable or not. Because like 46 immediately is a little like high, but then if you factor for like over a few years, then it becomes like not that scary of a number. And then another like point I want to point out is that like obviously like what we've been talking about is relatively like a simpled down version of like their actual deal structures and what's going on. Like there's a lot of little clauses, there's a lot of little like tidbits and caveats in it. But like in general, I do think it's reasonable, especially like with the way the industry has been pacing and the way like workers have been being like it's not just in this industry, but like across Hollywood, we've also seen strikes. So like this kind of trend of like workers realizing their worth, I think is generally a reasonable thing. But specifically going to this industry, there was another part that I wanted to point out was about like batteries and like the electric vehicle part of it. And so I particularly found this part to be pretty interesting. And how like the UAW wants like automakers to like pay workers at their battery plants to be the same like wages as workers who are actually building the engines and the transmissions, things like that. And so I think that's particularly interesting. And like I think that demand for like equal pay like across different not sectors, but like across different like tasks of the company does make sense. And then like on Ford's side though, like they do say like, okay, like we haven't even like technically hired people for the battery plants, so like we can't really even negotiate with them. But I think like in general, like the union just standing up for their workers, like whether it be future or not, like arguing for a higher pay standard is reasonable. Especially like considering everything else we just said before too. And then another thing was that like for the like the wage hikes, like the UAW demanded like this 46%, and the Ford had previously said they wanted to do 20%, which like is a little low, especially considering it is again over 4 years, and then you would be having like regular salary increases anyways. And so I think definitely like it is reasonable if you look at it from like a number standpoint, like the general economy standpoint.
Yeah, me personally, I think the demands are reasonable because, the wages have not been adapted to the current economic situation, except especially for these type of workers who, have been working much more than what they pay. And but from a perspective of, a factory owner or car manufacturer, these demands might be unreasonable. And a very prominent person, aka Elon Musk, has, expressed his negative opinions on the strike. And what's, I think, special about this is because Tesla does not allow unionized workers working at their factories. And this has recently, because of the United Auto Workers strike, has been brought to the spotlight, and they have been found for like illegally, preventing unionized labor. And so there are definitely a lot of, these strikes they want to help the workers, but when you pay the workers a lot from a business perspective, then your costs go up, and these car manufacturers don't like that. So this leads to kind of my next question, which is how has the United Auto Workers strike affected the auto industry and the economy as a whole?
Yeah, so the auto workers strike, essentially in the first 10 days, the economy already lost more than $5 billion. And I think that that's like a pretty big deal in terms of like these workers not going to work. That impacts every single like sector of like the automobile industry, from small shops to like the big these big automobiles that like they're working for, including like small car shops. It's like a trickle, I don't know, like trickle down economy, like where essentially with workers going on strike, there isn't um nobody's working, nobody's doing anything for these cars and building anything. So it's just essentially, even though it is like they're striking these big companies, is also has a major effect on like smaller shops and smaller companies that are also related to automobiles as well.
Yeah, I agree, and I'd like to also like mention that the strike could potentially have a 0.2% impact on the fourth quarter GDP if like the strike prolongs for quite a further amount of time, like a few months or something. So that's obviously it's gonna be a big effect. Like well, compared to like the GDP, like 0.2% may not seem like a lot, but when you compare to how much GDP America could earn in the fourth quarter, that is quite a bit. And I think that also, although the big three automakers, they're clearly not as dominant as they were before, even though they currently still do they still like manufacture around half of the US cars. Like it could still shake up like the economic situations for many. Like it could be like as a result of the strike, maybe increase because of the increased labor costs after the negotiations go through, we could see car prices go up just to like recoup like the finances that could be like lost from increasing the costs.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. Another thing I wanted to point out was also from the perspective of like the strikers and like the workers that are going on strike. And so obviously like if you're on strike, the company like you're not working, so like you're just not getting paid. Like UAW is paying the workers around $500 per week that they're on strike, and that is like half like roughly half of their income for the week, like if they were working normally. And I just want to point out that like some workers, like if it's just a few weeks, then that's okay, right? Then because like they have money saved up, or like they don't actually, like their financial situation doesn't really depend exactly on like a few $1,000s. But there's also workers who are on strike because they believe in the mission, but at the same time, these few weeks that they have been on strike has been like pretty harmful to their own financial situation. So I think like that's also something important to consider for the workers, and like sitting in that position of like the strikers, right? Like if you're in this union, like the union as a whole is going on strike, but then like individually considering your financial situations and like long-term, I guess, long-term versus short-term goals, and like what's more valuable for you. I think that's definitely another impact of like looking not just at like the external parts, but also the workers themselves.
Yeah, and I think I would want to add like opinion on, the effect on the local economy, not the overall US economy, because it's pretty obvious that like what Jack said, that the big three car manufacturers don't have, such a big control over the car manufacturing industry in the US. And because of that, there won't be a really big impact on the global, like on the US economy as a whole. There might be a dip, but it wouldn't cause a major recession. However, I think we should focus more on like the state of Michigan, because all of these manufacturers are kind of around that area. And since these members, the United Auto Worker members, are only receiving $500 a week, uh, just like Jackie said, even though like some might be financially better off than others, there will be a general trend of these workers not buying what they usually buy at their grocery store or at local businesses, and this will cause a bigger recession in the local economy as compared to the general economy overall in the U.S. And we talked about in the introduction a little bit about the United Auto Worker president Sean Fain and his impact on making the strike such an important deal. So, what role does this new president play in the strike that is different from previous presidents?
So yeah, Fane is kind of like a kind of like a polarizing figure in terms of like leading these strikes. He expanded it across 41 locations in late September. And then what he's known for is basically his opposition to like conceding the strike. And he kind of broke decades long tradition of shaking hands with like the automotive, like the big CEOs before the strike, to kind of like show a sense of respect, I guess. But like I think what he's trying to do is trying to make a point that they're willing to do whatever it takes to be able to receive fair pay and kind of up the standard of what they're looking for. And they kind of tells the CEOs like that they're not playing around. They really they they're gonna get what they came for. So that's kind of setting the tone for the entire strike. I think that's what he does well.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think top like Sean Fain also has like a lot of experience in like different fields, so he understands really what's going on with the car industry and like what the pay is and what the hard work is. Like for example, he's like an electrician, he's done labor organizing in factories, he's also been a business manager, so he definitely understands like the current process of like labor amid the current system of like car manufacturing. So bringing that unique perspective in allowed him to like really relate to the current issue, and that really makes him like super qualified and someone to look up to when like leading these strikes. And also he's like as Kyvan said, like Fain is like breaking that long tradition of like refusing to shake like hands with automakers like CEOs. Like instead what he's doing is he's shaking hands with workers, and then he's trying to like mobilize them for his cause, and that's something that's very different from what the previous presidents have been doing, and it just really like emphasizes the issue that's going on, and like how Fain is like so committed to get to fight for this issue.
Yeah, for sure, definitely. I think like another thing about Fane is like Kyron said, he's a very controversial figure. He's a very some people call him like almost a little bit extreme, or like that's kind of what the leaders on like the industry are calling him. But I think one thing that really sets him apart is just how like how strong his demands are. Like I know a lot of people's initial reactions to like the 46% like wage increase was, whoa, that's a lot. Or like other things like the 4-day weeks, or some of his other demands, people were like, oh, that's very just almost unheard of, or like very up there. And on the other side, people have been saying like, oh, that's just like what the workers want. And Sean Fain is one of the only leaders who is actually delivering on like what his, I guess, people like want. And I think that's something. And then I think in general, people just have said that like even for like union leaders, he has been very like difficult and like very like perseverant, I guess, in his demands and not backing down from them. There was like a UC Berkeley professor who was talking about like how like because of his toughness and because of how willing he is to push forward with his goals, that has caught a lot of companies off guard, because historically, like, you know, you kind of like negotiate together, but like people have said that he's very like, no, this is what I want, like, and this is what our workers want. And I think that's definitely something that really sets him apart, and also what sets him apart in his success with this like strike and deal going on.
Yeah, he's as the president of the United Auto Workers. Sean Fain is definitely, a really strong figure representing the strike. And I think I want to point out that, a lot of previous United Auto Worker presidents and strike presidents, they have been, like it's not a few, it's quite a bit, have been arrested for, fraud, and then basically planning, negotiating behind closed doors that negatively impacted the workers on strike. And the United Auto Worker president, the new Sean Fain, really wants to break the stereotype, because as like Kywin and Jack said, like Fain has refused to shake hands with these automaker CEOs, and that he is setting a point that he is not going to do these negotiations behind closed doors and create something that's only beneficial to him and not beneficial to the workers on strike who really need this money. And he's trying to break that stereotype and be strong and make sure the changes are made for good, and make sure the economic situation for these workers are made for the better. So moving on to, the tiered employment system that we have all been mentioning. So what is your opinion on the tiered employment system that underpays newer employees, and how can this system be improved?
I actually think that like in terms of underpaying new employees, it like to a certain point, it's not that big of a deal. But I think where it is right now, it's like they're putting it so that there's like newer workers can be paid less up to a certain amount of time, and they're kind of purposely doing that. But I think that if you are loyal to the company, you're staying there and you're working for a certain amount of years, I think that yeah, you do deserve to get raises, and deserve to get paid. I don't know, like a little bit more than, let's say, somebody that just comes in and joins the company. But in terms of what we are right now with this tiered employment system, for auto workers, I think that it needs to be improved. I don't think that the disparity should be that big between older workers and newer workers, especially if they're doing the same thing. And especially since that tier was based off in 2007. So even the quote unquote newer workers have already worked there for what, like 16 years. So that's like committing 16 years of your life to a company that still decides to pay you less. So I think that needs to change. Maybe they move that year up to, I don't know, like a couple years before, but like I think that there needs to be like a closer gap between something that decide to give to like quote unquote like older employees who have stuck with the company longer and a newer employee.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Like, I think like a thing that I could use to like improve the system is like I know like Hyven mentioned that like newer workers can be paid less to like a certain amount of time before being adjusted. Like that, I feel like that time could be like sooner for like the employee to like adjust the company, kind of like a company trying a pilot program on an employee, trying to figure out if he's a good fit or not. And once that has been like determined after for quite a while, then it is like possible for the employee to be given like a raise and then like continue working with that company and then receiving another raise as like a, I guess a legacy bonus over like another like period of time. So that could be like a suggestion that could help out the system. Yeah, and definitely right now the current system promotes a large disparity between newer workers and more like legacy workers who have worked with the company for a long time. So that disparity needs to be like reduced and definitely even if the newer and like older workers are like working for like the same job, the same amount of time, there definitely needs to be like some sort of like equality between those wages. And I think that's what I would suggest to improve the system.
Yeah, I think so too, like closing that disparity and just like that gap. I think another thing is like not necessarily a mindset shift, but like a company, I guess like policy shift is like if you're a newer worker, like not so much like docking their pay, but more of like having your baseline and then rewarding employees like if you've been there for longer, because that just makes like like it's not unfair to the new workers, but also you're giving like loyal workers an increased incentive. And I think like that works out so much better than being like, oh, like if you're new, we're just gonna pay you less. Like that just I don't know, it feels very like undercutting and like to a certain extent, like yes, it does make sense. Like if you're new, like you're not like as experienced, so like technically you're not going to be able to do as much, but that's all kind of in the process of like learning and like getting good at your job, right? So I think like having like that change in what it is, it would be pretty beneficial and would make sense.
Yeah, and I think one of the major reasons why this two-tiered wage system exists in these car manufacturers is like a way to cut costs because they can hire workers at a much cheaper rate and keeping them in the company because in as the idea of like, oh, we're gonna pay you more later on, but at a much cheaper rate. So they're just saving on costs. And that's like the only major reason that I believe that is going on behind the two-tiered wage system. And in my opinion, that's unreasonable because, as Kaiwan said, like it's been 16 years for some workers, and they're still considered newer employees, and that is a problematic for definitely their financial situation. So in general, how effective are the United Auto Worker strikes?
In general, I think that auto worker strikes, I think that most people tend to support them. I know that like AOC, like this recent one, AOC is like giving words of support to these strike workers. I think in terms of like because people, I think in general people want fair pay, but there's this extent to which like the strike is gonna be like impacting like others' everyday lives, and it just can't go on anymore at that point. But I think overall strikes are when people truly commit to a strike and they actually go for it, there's a lot of support within the community usually. And I think that overall the benefits of a strike are usually positive, where they usually do get maybe not entirely what they asked for, but something that's a lot better than their current situation. So I just think that strikes overall are positive.
Yeah, I agree that like when strikes can be like committed to and like in the end they reach like a negotiation, a fair like negotiation between the higher ups and the people who are fighting for the strike, the people who are striking, I definitely think that it could improve the situations of some. As of right now in the UAW strike, like although we see that like most people seem to like support it, like a Pew Research center study like showed that like 50% of people supported it, while like 25% were neutral, around 25% were like against it right now, like a lot of this could possibly change because this strike is still new. It's only been like 2 or 3 weeks for the strike, but right now the negotiations between the UAW and the auto manufacturers are kind of stagnant, and that's why Sean Fain is trying to like convince more people to like join the strike right now. So if his efforts like do succeed, and there's like a ton more workers that join the strike, and then the big three will like look and see, oh, this is a problem. This is going to impact our business a lot. We need to get negotiating soon. But I think right now, with like the demands, obviously the big three are not going to they're not going to be willing to like work with those demands because that will raise up their labor costs significantly. Right now, I feel like until those negotiations happen, it's currently ineffective, but definitely we could see that change within the next few weeks or months.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like also speaking of like how many people support it, I think there was like some statistic about how like the majority of Americans do support it and like only 19 or like 20-ish% of people are against it. So I think like in general the support or like the non-supporting group is relatively low. So that definitely is like on their side, I guess. And I also think that in terms of strikes, like I think someone mentioned this before, but strikes in general, if you are able to get a relatively large group of people to like all come together and strike against a company or like against this industry, and not just like give into negotiations the first round, kind of like what Sean Fain didn't do. I think like they can be very, very impactful in getting the demands because like at the end of the day, like a company is kind of nothing without people working for it. Like, yes, you have like this entire structure in place, but like if no one's building your cars, if no one's like making like your products, it like kind of fails. So like it kind of takes like two things to cooperate together. And I think like if you're as a union able to organize your workers well, able to keep that morale up, if able to like have not just like stalling for no reason, but like able to actually make progress, I think that could be very, very effective. And I think like there is some progress with the strikes and like they are getting close to having a deal done. So like that in itself shows that it has been pretty successful.
Yeah, and even though we're unable to determine the complete effectiveness, basically how these changes the United Auto Workers want will get implemented, I personally think that these strikes are pretty effective because they have received the attention nationwide, and not a lot of strikes get that much attention. And based even though like their popularity is super high, I think the president, Fain, has played a really big part of this because he employed this new strategy of unpredictedness. He would have small groups of workers, go on strike at random intervals of time, and this particular strategy has worked to his favor because car manufacturers are they don't know when a strike will happen. They don't know how many will go on strike, and they don't know what time it will take place at. And this has been particularly effective, at driving that deal, which, like Jackie said, that they're nearing in on. So, what are the potential solutions, especially for the car manufacturers, to end the strike and meet the demands of the workers?
Yeah, I think that they need to kind of sit down with each other and have a negotiation. I don't think, of course, not 100% of the strike's demands are probably going to be met, but I think the main things that they're demanding have to be addressed in terms of like the tiered gaps. They need to figure out something to kind of change that because working 16 years at a company should not make you a newer worker and get you paid less than what you deserve. And also like yeah, a basic pay increase for everyone working. I think there needs to be something that happens to help them cover because Right now they're only making like what $500 a week, which is a lot less than they would be working normally. I think that I don't know if this is how it works, but maybe like the company should be giving them like at first like a check that kind of guarantees that they have enough money to kind of support them, because the past couple weeks or whatnot they've been on strike and they've been making like around 40% of their basic income. So I just think that in terms of coming to a solution, they need to address all of the main points that are listed in the strike and come together and have a basic negotiation.
Yeah, I definitely agree with like that negotiation is definitely very necessary between the labor union and the big three companies to like end the strike. Like obviously like the labor union thinks that these like their demands are fair because of how the not only the higher like living costs, but also like what is going on in the industry, and like they've like able to see that it may be like a little bit like unsustainable for their life to continue on the current wage. But however, on the other hand, like you have the auto workers. I mean, the auto companies, they don't think that's reasonable because it's going to drive up their labor costs by like a lot, and there's going to be like obviously a conflicting opinion about that. But I definitely there will be a negotiation that is needed to like solve the issue, and pretty much every other like point that is being addressed as the industry evolves, we could definitely see more like self-driving cars or like electric cars. So we'll definitely see like workers able to apply their trade there when like when there's like more like I guess structural unemployment that occurs when some like car models are like discontinued. So we could also see that being addressed. And also like the tier system, we could definitely need a negotiation on potentially reducing this disparity and like putting in new thresholds for like pay raises depending on like how much time a company has been, how much time an employee has been working at a company.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's like a lot of little smaller caveats than like the bigger ones of like pay increases, less like work hours, things like that, just like more fairness in terms of pay. And like obviously we mentioned the tier system. But there's like a few other ones, like little caveats in there too, like the electric batteries that I talked about too. Um, and I think like in terms of like ending the strike or like having negotiations, it kind of really depends on like both sides. And it also depends on like, I think this goes for any strike in general. It's not very specific to this specific one that's going on right now. Is like it depends on like how much negotiating power you have. Like if you are the union leader and you know like if you continue to go on with this strike, like you guys are going to do a lot of damage and like it's going to be horrible for the company, then obviously like you have a lot more power. But like if as a union you don't really have that much bargaining power, then it's not going to be as effective. So I think considering that part is definitely there. But like in terms of like for this situation as a whole, I think like there have been reports that negotiations are relatively close and like they are getting like there has been progress. So I think like at this point we're kind of just seeing like what happens, and also like when it does end, I think we'll be able to see like the effects of it, specifically because like this was the longest strike since I think 1970s, where like it went on for like 2-3 months. And so I think it's 2 months, like a little bit more than that, but like that's definitely a long strike. And so like when it's done, we'll be able to go back and look at like just the effects of what it made.
Yeah, and in my opinion, I think to end this strike, the companies simply need to give in to the demands of the United Auto Workers, and give them competitive wages, give them overtime payment, better employment benefits, etc. And as based on history, I think the government also plays a large role, because if the government is on the side of the manufacturers, then the strike will be shut down by the military, and then all the workers lose. But if the government is on the workers side, or simply does not interfere with whatever is going on, then we can see situations like this where the workers are trying to fight for things they believe are crucial to your job. And that's what we kind of see today. And certain decades ago, that might have not been the case. And so how can similar strikes be prevented in the future? And this is not specific to car manufacturing, but maybe in other sectors. And since we have seen a lot of different strikes happening in like Hollywood, like how can these strikes be prevented in different sectors?
I think the overall main thing is probably like effective communication and like just mutual like a sense of respect, I guess, between workers and the big bosses that are at these companies. Because I think by having like open and transparent communications between like what unions and management basically allows you to kind of talk about it before any strike occurs, and kind of maybe you can like solve it in that sense instead of forcing an all-out strike. And another main thing is just like having fair compensation for your workers from the very start. I think that's like really not that hard, but some CEOs like just need, and different like companies, they need to give workers better compensation. And sometimes that's the only thing that workers are striking for. They just want to be fairly paid for what they do. So in terms of doing a couple of these things better, being having better communication and just paying workers fairly, I think that can prevent like a majority of strikes from even like happening from the beginning.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Just want to tackle the point that Kyvan talked about, like having more like fair pay. I feel like sometimes they don't do that. They need to like change that relative to like how like the economy or the state of that industry is doing. Like some companies aren't doing that, and that's obviously caused a disparity because of like higher living costs and what has happened to the economy in the past few years. So yeah, that has definitely been like unsustainable for their like living condition. And also, I'd like to mention that potentially like similar strikes can be prevented by just like looking at, like I kind of mentioned this earlier, but how the industry has like evolved. Like for example, like in Hollywood, like the script writers, there's like less demand for them because like a lot of things can be like digital, like you can like animate with like you could potentially animate with like AI and stuff like that. We could definitely see that happen with the auto industry because we have some like self-driving cars and electric cars that are being developed, and that decreases demand for the just those like conventional like cars that you like see. So definitely I think that companies need to pay more attention to those evolving industries and potentially how employees can like be involved in those industries just in case structural unemployment does eventually happen. And that is definitely something that the company should take into account, and that could help avoid strikes in the future.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think in general, like having, like we said, like maintaining this healthy workplace relationships is very important. And like, I guess negotiating before it gets to that point of a strike, because it's not just like, yeah, we're unhappy, so immediately we're going to go on a strike. Like there is like things that lead up to it. So I think like if you are able to negotiate like before that strike happens is also pretty important. And just like for historical reference, like um compared to like in the past in like the 20th century, like organized labor movements have become less um popular, I guess. Like okay, obviously like right now like we're seeing a lot of strikes like Hollywood, etc., like writer strikes, things like that. But like in general, this organized like labor and like organized unions, like their strikes and movements have been on the decline in general. And so I think like there definitely needs to be like there is like more, I guess, negotiations happening behind the scenes. And I think like if you're able to like continue those in a positive and I guess like in a non-striking way, that would be very like a good way to like I guess avoid that, if you're just able to like listen to the demands and like kind of work with each other and realize that like if you're both like at opposite sides, like you can't just 100% get exactly what you want in the hikes, but you also can't get like nothing. So I think like looking at from a relatively fair perspective, like okay, if the industry is doing well, then like our workers should also be rewarded proportionally. Or like if our industry is failing, you can't really expect like salaries to go up a lot. And so I think like looking at it from a fair perspective and like having a healthy dialogue between the two parties would be important going forward.
Yeah, and I think the general idea here is that there needs to be a kind of mutual understanding between the workers and their bosses. It's just like if there is open communication, if there is a mutual kind of respect going on, then the workers will understand if the economy is doing bad, then or the company is doing bad, and then they will understand if their wages don't get increased that year. They'll understand the fact, and once it gets better, and then they'll receive their benefits for contributing towards that growth. And I think that kind of communication and relationship between the workers and their bosses would lead to less strikes happening, because simply the workers are understanding they respect their bosses and the bosses respect them, and then this leads to less unhappiness in their job, and then higher job satisfaction, etc. So thank you guys for tuning in into this episode on the United Auto Workers recent strike, and make sure to tune in on another interesting episode on the Teams for Business podcast.